Hello everyone, my name is Jonathan. I will be your instructor for this CIT narrative writing course. This example video assumes that you have already read the 5 Steps to Narrative Writing instruction article and watched the other videos explaining these 5 steps. You should have also read the short non-fiction story provided, Bullfrog Hunting, by author James A. Ferris, Jr. In this video, we will examine an example of non-fiction narrative writing to understand how it applies the principles previously discussed. As background, this story was taken from a collection of short stories originally written to the author's children. So that's why you get phrases like "your mother and I." This story was originally 2 stories about frog hunting, as well as some general information about how frog hunting is done and the laws regarding it in the author's home of Louisiana, USA. I have removed that extra information, and we will only be examining the second of the 2 stories. So let's first take a look at orientation. The next frog hunt worthy of mention was after your mother and I had been married less than 2 weeks. She, reluctantly, but being a good sport and loving me more than I deserved, accompanied me on another frog hunt on Little River. By that time, I had acquired a 5-horsepower Evinrude outboard motor, and we rented a boat at Body's Landing just downstream from the bridge that crosses the river between Fishville and Gina. I was very familiar with the river from about 5 miles upstream from the bridge all the way to Catahoula Lake, a distance of about 20 miles, the best I remember. So let's look at setting. First, where? She accompanied me on another frog hunt on Little River, so we're on a river. We rented a boat at Body's Landing, just downstream from the bridge that crosses the river between Fishville and Gina. So we're on a boat on this river, and it's somewhere between the 2 towns of Fishville and Gina. These are towns in Louisiana. What about when? All the world was dark, except for that lonesome beam of the headlight. We see this phrase a little bit later in the story, and this tells us that we are probably on this river at nighttime, probably well after sunset. And let's look at some of the characterization. The next frog hunt worthy of mention was after your mother and I had been married less than 2 weeks, so we know they are newlyweds. She, reluctantly, but being a good sport and loving me more than I deserved, accompanied me on another frog hunt. So the wife is amiable and loves her husband. But we also know something else here. Because of this word reluctantly, we know that she does not have a fondness for frog hunts. Later, we will discover that this is because she has an aversion to frogs themselves. She does not want them to jump on her. I was very familiar with the river from about 5 miles upstream from the bridge all the way to Catahoula Lake, a distance of about 20 miles, the best I can remember. So we know that the husband is an outdoorsman of some kind. He spent a lot of time on this river. We know that because it explains it through characterization. I can tell you that the author was a biologist working with the Fisheries and Wildlife Service, so he spent a lot of time going up and down rivers, investigating the wildlife. By that time, I had acquired a 5-horsepower Evinrude outboard motor, and we rented a boat at Body's Landing. So we also know that they do not own a boat, but instead own only a motor, and they rent the boat to use the motor. This tells us something about their socioeconomic situation. They have some money, but not enough to own a boat and pay for all the other things that owning a boat requires, like storage, transport, and upkeep. Characterization can, and often does, continue on past the orientation and into the problem and solution sections of a narrative. Your dear mother, quite an adventuress in other respects, was not a happy participant. So we see that in activities other than frog hunting, the wife has a spirit of adventure. The paddle in my left hand to leave the right hand free to grab the frogs, which I hoped, to find in Fish Creek. This simple parenthetical statement, we hoped and then I hoped, tells us something very important. The husband and the wife are not of the same mind in this activity. That the author chose to write it this way implies that at the time, he may have believed they were both going to enjoy this outing equally, but in hindsight, he realizes that he was the only one who would have enjoyed the experience. Despite my assurances and cool, calm voice to the contrary. So the narrator and husband is, or at least believes, that he is a calm and steady kind of person. Mother's protests became teary and demanding, and finally threatening, and with the intensity of her protests, my determination rose to greater heights to show her that she was mistaken. Here we see the wife's intensity of dislike of this activity shown openly. We also see that the husband is perhaps not taking these concerns very seriously, and he is rather stubbornly or proudly choosing to prove that his attitude about the situation is the correct one. Toward the end of the story, we learn that the husband's pride can be broken as he is eventually cowed by his mistake. All of that was done in utter silence, I being too afraid to speak, and Mother refusing to do so. So we also see here that the wife doesn't immediately forgive him. Finally, we see that the husband is willing to uphold his wife's honor and reputation by not spreading this story to the locals. You can rest assured that I didn't tell them that it was your sweet, gentle mother who had made the scream like a wounded panther. Let's move on to the problem. Not all problems have to be life or world-altering events. They can be very low stakes too, as in this story. The problem in this narrative is one of interpersonal conflict. There are other problems that your story might have, internal struggle in someone's mind or heart, losing things or people perhaps, anything that causes tension for the characters and for your reader can potentially be the problem of your narrative. So see if you can identify the interpersonal conflict here in this passage. Mother and I motored upstream under the bridge that crossed the river and got opposite the mouth of Fish Creek on the right descending bank of the river. I cut the motor and quietly paddled into the mouth of Fish Creek. Sure enough, there on a root a frog sat about as big as my hat, and with his bulging eyes blinking ever so slowly in the beam of my headlight. Your dear mother, quite an adventuress in other respects, was not a happy participant in this endeavor from the moment I cut the motor and started paddling with only the headlight for illumination. All the world was dark except for that lonesome beam of the headlight. Before we spotted the frog, I had moved to the front of the boat and was sculling it along with the paddle in my left hand to leave the right hand free to grab the frogs, which I hoped, to find in Fish Creek. Of necessity, you have to get close to a frog to grab it by hand. The closer I got to the frog, the more insistent your mother's protests became, with the repeated phrase, "Don't, it'll jump on me." So the conflict here is between the husband and the wife. On one level, this is explored as the husband not being receptive to his wife's discomfort, but on a simpler level, this can be reduced to just being right or wrong. Two ideas about the scenario are presented, one by the wife, that the frog will jump on her, and the other by the husband, that the frog will not jump on her. So this is first clearly stated in this line. Your dear mother was not a happy participant in the endeavor from the moment I cut the motor and started paddling with only the headlight for illumination. As the story progresses, tension is built with phrases describing the wife's increasingly troubled actions, contrasting with phrases describing the husband's calm ones. The closer I got to the frog, the more insistent your mother's protests became. The protests became more insistent and finally frantic. I calmly sculled toward the frog with my hand extended. The side of the boat stroked ever so gently, almost like a caress, the root on which the frog was sitting. Finally, the tension comes to a climax with these 3 words. That frog jumped. Like the frog, all that tension that we've been building up hangs in the air while we anticipate where the frog will land. Our expectations hang in balance with possibility, the all too perfect possibility of the frog landing where we have been led to consider, on the wife, and the more likely possibilities that are anywhere else in the space around that frog. It could be the boat, the husband, the water, anywhere. Finally, let's see where this problem leads in the solution. The characters don't necessarily solve the problem, but it does change somehow. For this reason, the solution can also be called the resolution. Here the problem resolves and the tension is released. And we discover the outcome of the characters and the setting as well, how it affects the world. When the boat brushed that root, the frog jumped forward over my shoulder and straight into the lap of your dear mother. The problem is resolved by this, but not in the way any of the characters wanted. The immediate aftermath of the incident is the wife's brooding displeasure and the husband's sheepish, cowed demeanor. All of that was done in utter silence, I being afraid to speak and mother refusing to do so. But we also discover how the event affected others in the area, and make a note of the use of time words here. The next week, I went back to Body's Landing to rent a boat to bass fish, and the citizens, as Mr. Body called the natives, were all talking about having heard a panther scream up the river in the vicinity of Fish Creek. Finally, as mentioned earlier, we get a little further characterization, seeing that the husband is not willing to admit, probably for both his own sake as well as his wife's, that his wife was the cause of the commotion and that the fault was his. You can rest assured that I didn't tell them that it was your sweet, gentle mother who had made the scream like a wounded panther on the previous Friday night, when all the world was still and black and silent. As this story's main purpose is to entertain through a comedic scenario, no message or lesson is directly stated. The story, however, is neatly closed up by referring back to the setting in that line we just read, when all the world was still and black and silent. And that gives us a nice little end to our humorous narrative. So hopefully now you understand how the principles of narrative writing can apply to nonfiction narratives as well as fiction narratives, which was explained in the previous videos. So thank you for watching and good luck with your writing. Goodbye.